We have all heard the saying, to wish upon a star. But do you know where this saying originated? It originated in Europe in 2nd century AD. This saying comes from a Greek mathematician and astronomer, Ptolemy. We all know that the Greeks believed in mythical beings, gods who guided them along their way. Ptolemy believed that shooting stars were signs from the gods. He believed that the gods escaped through gaps in the sky in order to be closer to humans. He believed that when the gods used these gaps, shooting stars escaped from the heavens. So when you see a shooting star, it was believed the gods were close, and it was the perfect time to tell them your heart's desires. The truth is, it doesn't matter whether you believe in Greek mythology or Christianity. We all have a wish. Some wish for money, while others wish for love. But in the midst of wishing for love, our strong desire for it often tricks us. And what we believe to be love couldn't be further from it. September 21st, 1993. The world would make way for Xianna Graham. When she entered this world, the place she would call home would be Vallejo, California. At a young age, she would enjoy singing, dancing, playing dress up, and hanging out with family and friends. Life for a young Xianna was great, but things were soon to change. In 2001, Xianna would turn 8 years old, and with her birthday being September 21st, that's just weeks after a major event occurred. An event that would fill the sky with smoke, as well as filling the streets with screams. We now know this date to be 9/11, a day of terror. That day would manage to change the lives of many, and for young children with parents in the military, their lives would be altered. On October 7th of 2001, troops would be deployed to Afghanistan to begin what is known as Operation Enduring Freedom. During this time, Xianna's father would be deployed, but when he returned, things would be different. Xianna's father would begin to use drugs and alcohol, which would begin driving a wedge through the family. As time passes, her father's habits would become worse, and he would eventually fade out of her life. By the time Xianna was 12 years old, things had taken a drastic turn. She too had begun using drugs and alcohol. A normally well-behaved student would begin to slip with her grades, as well as her behavior. This would continue on until she was 14 years old. By 14, things had really gotten bad between her and her mother felt like she just couldn't control her. So, by the age of 14, she would be sent to live with her grandmother. The place her grandmother resided would be Marietta, Georgia. And upon making that transition, in the beginning, things were great. Xianna seemed to be enjoying her new town, as well as enjoying the company of her grandmother. She quickly acquired friends, and her teachers would often remark on her behavior. She's described as sweet, loving, and eager to learn. By the time Xianna was 15 years old, she would discover that she was pregnant with a child. Upon finding out she was pregnant, she was scared and didn't know exactly what to do. But she did know one thing. She vowed to take the best care of her child that she possibly could. When her child entered this world, she would marry her then boyfriend, and they would stay together for the next 4 years, even bringing forth another child. But by the time she was 18, they would call it quits, and they would go their separate ways. After breaking up, Xianna would date, but things would never go anywhere with anyone. By 19 years old, a single and struggling mother, would find out that she was once again pregnant with her third child. The father of her child was never exactly her boyfriend. They were never official. But even after finding out that they were conceiving a child, things wouldn't work out, and they too would go their separate ways. As a single mother, Xianna would often work odd jobs to take care of her children, such as babysitting or doing hair. By this period in her life, her father had returned, and they had begun mending their relationship. They would often hang out at places or grab a bite to eat. Although things were rough for Xianna, she did have a great support system, which made things just a little bit easier. By the year of 2018, Xianna would be 24 years old, and just like in the past, she would experience deja vu. She would bring forth another child, but things wouldn't work out with the father. So she would now be 24 years old and a single mother of 4 children. Although she worked around this time, her life was kind of at a standstill. She was still living with her grandmother, and life was extremely stressful. Around this time, she had begun to give up hope of any type of relationship. That is, until she meets a man who goes by the name of Christopher Scarborough. Xianna would meet Christopher on the job. Christopher owned his own painting business, in which Xianna was helping out. It was one of those gigs she had taken, like the many other gigs, to take care of her children. But while working together, a relationship would begin to blossom. Xianna would often tell her family and friends that this guy was the one. She would say how much of a good guy he was, how he cared about her and her 4 children. Xianna would quickly fall head over heels, but so would Christopher. And when Xianna loved, she loved hard, and with the entirety of her heart. Although in her past she had had failed relationships, she felt like this one was different. This one would be the one that worked out. She truly felt like when she looked into the eyes of Christopher, she was staring into her future. But something was soon to happen that would alter that scenario. The curtain would close on Xianna and Christopher's relationship, but it would also close on her life. August 23rd, 2018, approximately 3:03 a.m. At this time, officers of Marietta, Georgia would receive a call. In this call, they would be requesting a welfare check on Xianna. After receiving the call, the police would be dispatched to Xianna's home, where after knocking on the door, they would be greeted by her grandmother. They would let the grandmother know that a welfare check needed to be conducted, but the grandmother said that Xianna was fine, that she was asleep in her bedroom. Armed with this information, the Marietta Police Department would leave the home. But shortly after leaving, the grandmother would go upstairs to Xianna's room, just to make sure. But upon entering her room, she would discover her granddaughter deceased on the ground, in which afterwards, she would call the authorities back. Afterwards, the crime scene investigation unit would show up to the home, and upon analyzing Xianna's room, they realized there was no forced entry, and it didn't look like much of a struggle occurred. The authorities would process the scene, bag and tag evidence, and then ship the body of Xianna to the coroner's office for a full autopsy. The autopsy would conclude that she died due to asphyxiation. 24-year-old Xianna Graham, and mother of 4, was now the main focus of a homicide investigation. At the beginning of the investigation, they would do the normal rundown. They would question family and friends and ask if they knew anyone who wanted to harm Xianna. But no one she knew could name a single soul. But although they didn't have much information, they did have one thing: the 911 call requesting a welfare check. Police would pull the 911 call and they would try and trace the number. However, after receiving the background report, they would come to realize that it was a prepaid phone, not registered in anyone's name. But with Xianna being found deceased right after a welfare check was requested, they would decide to push forward. They would use GPS to gather the location from which the phone call was made, and after getting the coordinates, they would go to that home. After looking up the information of the home, they would realize that this was the home of the mother of Christopher Scarborough, the boyfriend of Xianna. Upon arriving at the home, the boyfriend would be present, so he would be taken down to headquarters for further questioning. When being interviewed, Christopher said that the relationship wasn't perfect, that they had their problems, but things were okay. He said that they had been dating for 7 months and that they were planning on getting married. At the time of the interview, Christopher did know that Xianna was deceased, so the authorities would press him further on why he made the welfare call. Christopher would then tell the authorities that he didn't know that she was dead. He said that he requested the call because she was back using drugs, and he had feared that she had maybe overdosed. He would tell the authorities that the last time he saw her was the night before she was found. He says that they got in an argument in which afterwards he left, and he told the authorities he took an Uber to his mother's home. With this information being given, they would flat out ask him, did he hurt his girlfriend? And he said no. When the interview concluded, they were able to corroborate his story that he took an Uber to his mother's home, and his mother would even provide an alibi, saying that he had been home yesterday all day. With an alibi provided and being able to corroborate the story that he took an Uber, he would essentially be cleared, and they would move on to finding other suspects. The detectives would turn their attention to her past relationships, because after all, she did have 4 children with other men, so they too needed to be cleared. The first stop would be with her ex-husband, the one she had her first child with. But come to find out, he didn't even live in Georgia anymore. After finding this out, they would move on to the other men. But one by one, each of her exes were cleared. They either had an alibi that they were at work or weren't living in the area anymore. Time is beginning to elapse, and days are turning into weeks, and there are no suspects in custody behind Xianna Graham. Before you know it, it was September 21st of 2018, where Xianna would have been turning 25 years old, and instead of celebrating her birthday, the homicide investigation team is looking for a culprit. The month of September would make way for October, but there was still no new information. The authorities were running down tips and leads, but they were leading to nowhere. With prior relationships being ruled out and no new leads, the investigators were beginning to think this would take forever to solve, because although they had processed the crime scene, there was little to no evidence. So in this circumstance, they were relying solely on a witness to come forward or someone to confess. By November of 2018, the case of Xianna Graham was beginning to go cold. But then the detectives would receive a break in the case. They would receive a call from the therapist of Xianna's son. This therapist had been working with her son ever since the death of his mother, helping him to move forward with his life. The therapist would tell the authorities that during one of his visits, he would make a shocking admission, something that would blow this case wide open. Xianna's son would tell his therapist that the night before his mother was found, he heard her and Christopher arguing. The son says that on that night, he was in a different room, watching TV, but from the other room, he could hear arguing, as well as bumping noises. Her son says, immediately following the bumping noises, he heard a loud snap, and afterwards, Christopher left the home. Normally in these situations, the authorities wonder whether or not a child was coerced into saying what they said. But in this instant, they knew what the child was saying was true, because they had only released the information that she died due to strangulation. But during the autopsy, they would come to find that Xianna also had a fractured neck. So the authorities knew that the snap that he was referring to was the injury that she had sustained. Armed with this information, the authorities would once again drag Christopher down to headquarters for further questioning. At first, he would repeat the same story. They had an argument, but then he left. But then the authorities would present the evidence that the son had given them. And afterwards, Christopher would break, and he would tell exactly what happened. He says that yes, he was present on that night, and that him and Xianna had gotten to an argument, and things got out of hand. He then began to choke her. He lost control, and when he came to, she was deceased. With admission of guilt, he would be transported to the local jail, awaiting his trial.
Truly a heartbreaking story for the family as well as for those in the community. Neighbors and relatives reportedly saw the couple in heated argument, and it was loved ones who called police after growing concern for this mother's well-being. When police got to the home, she was already dead. Marietta police say they were called to this home on Bonnydale Drive for a welfare check early Thursday morning.
When we entered the house, tragically, we did find a woman who had been strangled as a result of an ongoing domestic dispute.
Detectives say 24-year-old Xianna Graham was strangled to death by her live-in boyfriend, 27-year-old Christopher Gene Scarborough. Police say at least one of her 4 children was home at the time when she was murdered.
The kids always were playing outside.
Neighbor Keith Detweiler is used to seeing Graham's 4 children jumping on this trampoline.
I would say anybody that loses a mother or a grandmother or a family member, I'd say it's pretty bad. I'd say it's tragic at that point.
Scarborough has a history of violent behavior. According to these 2018 court documents, in one case, the warrant states he struck a man in the face, causing injuries. On another occasion, police were called after Scarborough allegedly headbutted another woman.
Our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to everyone involved in this tragedy.
Marietta police are taking it a step further, pleading with anyone who witnesses signs of abuse.
If you're the one watching this, if you know someone who may be in a situation that they shouldn't be, that it could be an abusive relationship, please, the life you could be saving could be theirs. Reach out to your local law enforcement. Ask us to just go check and make sure that everyone's okay. Certainly, we're not trying to pry on anyone's relationship, but we want to prevent a tragedy like this from happening.
But when his trial began, he would show up and plead guilty. He decided to take a plea deal. In exchange for him being offered the possibility of parole, he would plead guilty to malice murder. The judge presiding over his case would accept this deal, and 29-year-old Christopher Scarborough would be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. But when he went to prison, one question still remained. Why? Why exactly did this happen? Although this isn't an official motive, during the interview, Christopher would tell the authorities that Xianna was once pregnant with his child. During this time, Christopher was elated and he was happy to be a father. But Xianna would give him news that she had lost the baby. At first, Christopher was devastated, but then he would come to find that Xianna didn't lose the child. Xianna had gotten rid of the child without telling her boyfriend. At that point in time, Xianna didn't want any more children. Could this be the reason why Christopher acted out? It's a strong possibility. But one thing is for sure, Xianna Graham lost her life at 24 years old, and it's completely heartbreaking. Hopefully one day the family will have all the answers they deserve. Rest in peace, Xianna Graham. Thank you for being a light for others.